Your wife didn't fall, sir. The boy said it from the doorway of the library, one hand on the doorframe, the other pressed flat against his chest, where everything he had been holding for 3 days was trying to come out at once, and he was keeping it in order by force of will. He was 10 years old, dark brown skin, close-cropped hair, wearing a navy school sweater with a small hole at the left elbow that his father had told him not to pick at, dark trousers, and shoes that had been resoled at the heel by a man on Prentice Street for £4.50 because his father said a shoe with good leather in it was worth resoling twice before you gave up on it. His name was Joseph Addo, and he had been awake for 2 of the past 3 nights thinking about what he had seen, and he had come to this doorway because his father had told him not to, and because his father had been wrong. The man in the library looked up from the papers on his desk. His name was Edward Calloway. He was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular weight of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for 3 days and had not yet found a place to set it down. He was sitting at the desk in the library of Calloway House, the house he had built with his wife Margaret 22 years ago, the house she had filled with the specific presence of a person who understood that a house was not its architecture, but its accumulated daily life, and which had been, for 3 days, a house that Margaret was no longer in. He had been told his wife had fallen down the east staircase. He had been told this by the only other person in the house at the time, his wife's sister, Diana Reeve, who had been staying at Calloway House for the past 2 weeks, and who had found Margaret at the bottom of the stairs and called the ambulance and called Edward at his office, and had been, in the 3 days since, a presence in the house that Edward had not had the capacity to examine carefully because grief did not leave much capacity for careful examination. He looked at the boy in the doorway. He knew this boy. He knew him the way you knew the children of the people who worked for you when the child had grown up on your property, by face and name and the particular manner of someone who had spent their childhood in the specific combination of belonging and not belonging that came from living in the groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of an estate. Joseph Addo, Samuel Addo's son. Samuel had been the groundskeeper at Calloway House for 9 years. Joseph, Edward said. His voice was the voice of a man who had been speaking carefully for 3 days to avoid breaking. What did you say? Your wife didn't fall, Joseph said again. I was in the garden. I saw what happened. I've been trying to tell someone for 3 days, and I couldn't find the right way. So, I'm telling you directly. Edward Calloway looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he said, Come in. Close the door. The groundskeeper's cottage at Calloway House was a stone building set at the eastern edge of the property, separated from the main house by a kitchen garden and a stand of old oak trees that lost their leaves in October in a way that Margaret Calloway had always said was the most beautiful thing that happened on the property all year. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, a small sitting room, a kitchen, and a bathroom with a shower that ran warm rather than hot, which Samuel Addo had mentioned to Edward twice over 9 years, and Edward had twice said he would have sorted and had not yet sorted, not because he didn't intend to, but because the groundskeeper's cottage was not the part of Calloway House that his attention was usually directed toward. Samuel Addo had lived in the cottage for 9 years. Joseph had lived in it for all 10 years of his life, which meant that Calloway House and its grounds and its rhythms were the landscape of his entire conscious existence. He knew which gate creaked. He knew which section of the kitchen garden got the most morning light. He knew which window of the main house you could see the east staircase from if you were standing in the right spot in the garden. He had been standing in that spot 3 days ago. He had been there because he had been helping his father with the late-season pruning of the rose beds that ran along the east wall of the main house, and his father had sent him to the shed to fetch the long-handled shears, and he had taken the longer route back because the longer route passed the apple tree that still had 3 apples on it, and he had been monitoring those apples with the specific interest of a child who had identified a goal and was tracking its progress. He had been 10 feet from the east wall of the house when he saw the movement in the window. The window was on the first-floor landing of the east staircase, a tall sash window that let light into the staircase from the garden side. From the garden, if you were standing at the right angle, you could see through it to the staircase landing and the top of the stairs. Joseph had been standing at the right angle. He had seen 2 figures on the landing. He had recognized both of them. One was Margaret Calloway, wearing the pale blue cardigan she wore in the mornings, her hair not yet pinned up. She was standing at the top of the stairs. The other was Diana Reeve, Margaret's sister, in the dark clothing she had been wearing all week. She was standing very close to Margaret. Her back was to the window. Joseph had stopped walking because something about the way they were standing had caught his attention without him being able to say immediately what was wrong. He had stood still for 3 or 4 seconds, looking up at the window. And then Diana Reeve had moved. It was not a push. He would think about this very carefully in the 3 days that followed, in the way that he thought about things that mattered, carefully, from every angle, looking for other interpretations. It was not a push in the way you pushed someone away from you. It was more like a movement of both hands, forward and slightly down, the specific motion of someone placing weight on something and then releasing. The motion lasted perhaps 1 second, and then Margaret Calloway was not on the landing anymore. Joseph had stood in the garden for a moment that felt longer than it was, holding the long-handled shears, not yet able to move because his body had received the information before his mind had processed it. Then he had run to the east side of the house. He had heard the sound from inside, a sound he did not have a clean word for, the sound of the staircase receiving something it should not have received. He had run back to the rose beds. His father was there. His father had looked at him. Joseph's face had been doing something that faces did when they had just seen something that they did not know how to contain. Samuel Addo had looked at his son's face and had said, very quietly, "What did you see?" And Joseph had told him. Samuel Addo was 44 years old. He had come from Kumasi at 26, trained in horticulture, and had spent 18 years in England building a reputation as the kind of groundskeeper who understood that a garden was not decoration, but a living system that required the same quality of consistent attention as any other living thing. He had worked at 3 estates before Calloway House and had received good references from all 3, and he had understood, in the specific way that a man who had spent 18 years being very good at a job that kept him employed and housed and his son fed, understood things, what it meant to be employed and housed, and what it cost to be otherwise. He had listened to his son describe what he had seen from the garden. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "We don't know what we saw." Joseph had looked at him. "I know what I saw, Dad." "You saw something through a window from a distance. You don't know what it meant." "I know what it looked like." "Joseph." His father's voice had been very quiet. "Mrs. Calloway has died. Mr. Calloway is in terrible grief. Diana Reeve is his sister-in-law. If we go to Mr. Calloway and say what you're saying, and we're wrong, or if we're right, and she denies it, and there's no proof, we lose everything. You understand? Everything." He had looked at the main house. "We wait. If the police investigate, they'll find what they find. It's not our place." Joseph had looked at his father. He had understood, at 10 years old, what his father was carrying. The cottage, the job, the 9 years, the good references, the warm rather than hot shower, that was a small indignity, but still a shower in a cottage that was still a home. He had understood all of it. He had also known his father was wrong. He had spent 3 days being certain of both things simultaneously, that his father was wrong, and that he understood why his father was wrong. And those two certainties had kept him awake for 2 of those 3 nights, lying in his bed in the cottage, listening to the garden, and thinking about Margaret Calloway's pale blue cardigan and the motion of 2 hands that had lasted 1 second. On the 3rd day, he had gotten up early before his father was awake, and he had walked to the main house, and he had knocked on the library door. Joseph sat in the chair across from Edward's desk. The library was a room he had been in perhaps 4 times in his life. It was the room Edward used for working and for the specific privacy that working required, and it was not a room that the groundskeeper's son was usually in. But Edward had gestured to the chair, and Joseph had sat in it, because the chair was not the point, and the library was not the point, and nothing about this room was the point, except what Joseph had come here to say. He said it. He said it in order: the rose beds, the longer route, the apple tree, the window, the 2 figures, what he had seen, the motion, the sound, the running back to his father, what his father had said. Edward Calloway listened the way the people who needed to listen listened, completely, without interrupting, without the small sounds people made to show they were following. He sat very still, with his hands flat on the desk, and he listened to a 10-year-old boy describe what had happened on the east staircase landing 3 days ago in the language of someone who had thought about it very carefully and was giving the account and not the interpretation. When Joseph finished, Edward was quiet for a long time. "Your father knows you're here?" he said. "No, sir. He was asleep when I left." Edward looked at the desk. He looked at the papers that had been on it when Joseph came in. Documents, legal things, the specific administrative weight that arrived in the wake of a death. He looked at them with the expression of a man who has just had the frame around a picture changed and is seeing the picture differently. "Joseph," he said, 3 days. You've been carrying this for 3 days." "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you come sooner?" Joseph thought about this. He thought about his father's voice. 9 years, everything. We lose everything. "I was trying to find the right way," he said, "and I needed to be certain I was going to say it correctly." "Are you certain of what you saw?" Joseph looked at Edward Calloway across the desk. He thought about the window, the pale blue cardigan, the motion that had lasted 1 second, the specific quality of the sound from inside the house. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm certain." Edward stood. He walked to the library window, not the east window, the west window, the one that looked over the front drive. Diana Reeves' car was visible at the far end of the drive. She had been at Calloway House every day since Margaret's death. She had been, in those 3 days, attentive and present and quietly managing the funeral arrangements, the condolence calls, the practical details that grief left undone. She had been exactly what a bereaved family member was supposed to be. Edward thought about this. He thought about Diana Reeve at the bottom of the east staircase, finding Margaret. He thought about Diana making the call to the ambulance, then the call to Edward. He thought about the way Diana had sounded on the phone, the specific quality of the distress in her voice, which he had received as a person, received things when they were already in motion toward the worst information, without examining it. He thought about his wife in her pale blue cardigan on the staircase landing on a Tuesday morning. He thought about a 10-year-old boy watching from the garden with long-handled shears and 3 apples in a tree. He picked up his phone. He called a man named Charles Webb. Charles Webb was a solicitor, not the firm that handled the Calloway estate's affairs, but a man Edward had known for 30 years, who had been in the same year at school, who was the kind of solicitor you called when you needed someone who would listen to something unusual and not immediately tell you what you wanted to hear. Charles answered on the 2nd ring. Edward told him. He told him in the same order Joseph had told him. He was a man who understood that order was how you made sense of things, and that the order in which information arrived mattered as much as the information itself. He told Charles about Joseph. He told Charles about the window and the landing and the motion and the sound. He told Charles about Diana, who was at the estate right now, who had been there every day. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't say anything to her. Don't change anything about how you behave toward her. I'm calling someone I trust at the police, not the officers who took the initial report, someone above that. They'll want to speak to the boy." "The boy's father works here," Edward said. "I need to. His position here can't be—" "Edward." Charles's voice was steady. "Samuel Addo's position is not in question regardless of what happens. You understand me? Whatever his son saw, whatever he said or didn't say about it, his position at Calloway House is not contingent on any of this. You should tell him that directly. Today." "Yes," Edward said. "I will." He ended the call. He looked at Joseph, who was still sitting in the chair across the desk with his hands in his lap and the small hole at the elbow of his school sweater and the re-soled heels of his shoes. "I need to call your father," Edward said. Joseph looked at him. Something moved across the boy's face, the specific expression of someone who has done something their parent told them not to do and is now at the point where the parent is going to know about it. "He's going to be angry," Joseph said. "Probably," Edward said. "He's going to be frightened, which often presents as anger." He looked at the boy. "His position here is safe. Whatever he said to you, whatever he decided, his position here is not affected by any of this. I want you to know that before he knows you're in this room." Joseph looked at him. He read the statement the way he read all statements, looking for whether it was the kind of thing people said and meant or the kind of thing people said because it was the right thing to say. He decided it was the first kind. "Thank you, sir," he said. Samuel Addo arrived at the library door 11 minutes later. He had walked from the cottage through the kitchen garden and the oak trees with the specific contained urgency of a man who has received a call that told him less than he needed to know and more than he was comfortable with. He was wearing his work clothes, dark green trousers, a heavy work shirt, the jacket he wore in the colder months. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them, permanently slightly stained at the knuckles from soil and plant matter, strong, careful. He stopped in the library doorway and looked at his son. Joseph looked back at him. Samuel looked at Edward. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His voice was controlled and professional, and underneath the control was something that Edward recognized as the specific fear of a man who has spent 9 years building something that might now be at risk. "Samuel," Edward said, "come in. Sit down." Samuel came in. He did not sit down. He stood behind the chair next to Joseph's, his hands on the chair back. "Joseph told me what he saw," Edward said, "from the garden, 3 days ago." Samuel looked at his son. Joseph looked at the floor for a moment, then back at his father. "Dad," Joseph said, "I had to." Samuel looked at Edward. His expression was the expression of a man deciding which of several difficult things to say first and finding none of them satisfactory. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "my son, what he thinks he saw." "Samuel." Edward's voice was not unkind. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm not asking you to make a decision about what you believe or what you're prepared to say. I've already called Charles Webb, and Charles has already called the police. What Joseph saw, what he told me, is in motion now. It's beyond the point where anyone needs to decide whether to say it." Samuel looked at him. "Your position here," Edward said, "is not part of this conversation. I want you to hear that clearly. Whatever you said to Joseph 3 days ago, whatever decision you made about what to do with what he told you, I understand why you made it, and it doesn't change anything about your position here." He paused. 9 years, Samuel. I know the difference between a man protecting himself and a man choosing wrong. You were protecting yourself and your son. I understand that. Samuel stood behind the chair for a long moment. His hands were on the chair back. His son was sitting in the chair in front of him, with a small hole at the elbow of his school sweater and the wreath-old heels of his shoes. "He came to you anyway," Samuel said. It was not exactly a question. "Yes," Edward said. Samuel looked at his son. Joseph looked at his father. Between them, the 3 days were visible. The 2 nights Joseph had spent awake, the conversation in the rosebeds, the instruction to stay silent, the silence kept for 3 days and then not kept. "You disobeyed me," Samuel said. "Yes, Dad." "You came here when I told you not to." "Yes, Dad." Samuel was quiet for a moment. His jaw was set. His hands on the chair back were very still. "Tell me why," he said. Joseph looked at his father. He thought about the pale blue cardigan. He thought about the motion that lasted 1 second. He thought about Margaret Calloway, who had never spoken to him directly except once, 3 years ago, when she had found him looking at the apple tree and had told him that the variety was called a Cox and that a Cox apple was worth waiting for. "Because she didn't fall," he said. "And someone needed to say so. And you weren't going to say so. And I was the only other person who knew." Samuel looked at his son for a long time. Then he took his hands off the chair back. He pulled the chair out. He sat down. The detective who came was a woman named Priya Sandhu, whom Charles Webb had vouched for, and who arrived at Calloway House in an unmarked car with a colleague and a specific quality of attention that told Edward she had been given enough information to understand what she was coming to. She spoke to Edward first, briefly. Then she asked to speak to Joseph. She spoke to Joseph in the library, Edward and Samuel both present, because Joseph was 10 years old and was not going to be interviewed without his father in the room, which was something Priya Sandhu had said as a statement rather than a suggestion. Samuel sat beside his son. Edward sat to the side. Priya asked Joseph to tell her what he had seen. Joseph told her. In order, from the longer route to the apple tree, to the window, to the 2 figures, to the motion, to the sound. He told it the same way he had told Edward, because it was the same account. There was only one account, which was what he had seen, and it did not change because the listener changed. Priya listened. She asked him to go back once, to the motion specifically, and to describe it again in his own words. He described it again in the same words, because they were his words, and they were the accurate ones. When he finished, she looked at him. "Joseph," she said, "the window, how far were you from it when you saw this?" "About 10 feet from the wall, maybe a little less." "And the light, it was morning?" "About 9:30, bright. The sun was on the east side of the house." "Could you see both faces clearly?" "Mrs. Calloway's face, Diana Reeve's back." "You're certain it was Diana Reeve?" "Yes. I've known her for 2 weeks. She's been at the house every day. I know how she stands. I know her hair. I know the clothes she wears." He paused. "I'm certain." Priya looked at her colleague. Then she looked at Samuel Addo. "Mr. Addo," she said, "your son told you what he saw on the day it happened." Samuel looked at his hands. "Yes." "And you advised him not to come forward." A pause. "Yes." "Can you tell me why?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. He looked at Joseph, who was looking at the floor. "Because I was afraid," Samuel said. He said it simply, without excuse or decoration. 9 years at this house, the cottage, Joseph's school. I was afraid of what would happen if we said something, and it went wrong. He paused. I was wrong to be afraid of that. But I was. Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Thank you for saying that clearly. She looked at Joseph. You came forward anyway, she said. Yes, ma'am. 3 days later. I needed to think about how to say it correctly, Joseph said, and I needed to be certain. Are you certain? Joseph looked at Priya Sandhu across the library table. He thought about the window for the last time, the pale blue cardigan, the morning light on the east side of the house, the motion that lasted 1 second, the sound from inside. Yes, he said, I'm certain. Before the officers arrived, Edward sat alone in the library for 20 minutes. He sat with what he now understood about the 3 days that had just passed. Diana had been in the house for all 3 of them. She had sat beside him at the table where he could not eat. She had spoken to the funeral director on his behalf because he had not been able to make the calls. She had answered the door when the condolence flowers came and placed them in the rooms and written down the names of who had sent them. She had done all of these things with the specific quiet efficiency of someone who had decided how to behave and was executing that decision faithfully. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the pale blue cardigan, which was the cardigan Margaret wore on Tuesday mornings when she had planned to garden in the afternoon and wanted to be comfortable in the morning first. He thought about the very particular and irreplaceable fact of a person, which he had understood abstractly for 58 years and understood concretely now in the way you only understood concrete things, by the specific absence of them. He sat with this for 20 minutes. Then he opened the library door. Diana Reeve was in the sitting room of Calloway House when 2 uniformed officers and Priya Sandhu came to speak with her. She had been there when the cars arrived, and she had not attempted to leave, which told Priya something about Diana Reeve's particular quality of composure. She was 53 years old, Margaret's younger sister, with the same dark hair Margaret had had and the same cheekbones, and the specific contained expression of a woman who had been managing something very carefully for 3 days and was now at the point where the management was going to end. She did not say anything useful in the initial conversation. Her lawyer arrived within 40 minutes, which was fast enough to tell its own story about preparation. But the physical evidence at the east staircase landing, examined that afternoon by forensic officers who had been given specific direction by Priya Sandhu, based on what Joseph had described, told a story that did not require Diana Reeve to say anything useful. The landing had a small table with a vase on it. The vase had been moved. The circle of dust beneath it was not centered under the vase's base. A small section of the carpet runner on the landing had fibers caught in a way consistent with someone having gripped it and then released. And the direction of Margaret Calloway's fall, reconstructed from the position in which she had been found, and the specific impact pattern, was more consistent with a point of origin at the center of the landing than at the top of the stairs. None of it was conclusive alone. All of it together, with the testimony of a 10-year-old boy who had been standing at the right angle in a garden at 9:30 in the morning, pointed in a direction that did not accommodate a simple fall. The investigation took 11 weeks. Edward did not attend most of it. He attended the parts that required him and spent the rest of the time in Calloway House doing what a person did after their wife died, which was a set of activities that had no clean description, and that took the specific time they took without any regard for what the person going through them needed. Joseph continued to come to school every day. He continued to help his father with the garden on weekends. He continued to monitor the last 3 apples on the apple tree, which finally came down in a storm in late November, which he recorded in the notebook he kept in his school bag, a soft-cover notebook in which he wrote things that seemed worth keeping. In the weeks that followed, Calloway House did the thing that houses did after a death. It continued. The rooms that had been filled with flowers gradually returned to their usual arrangement. The condolence cards that had covered the mantelpiece in the sitting room were put away by Edward himself, one afternoon in early November, in a box that he put in the study where Margaret had kept her books. The kitchen garden was put to bed for winter by Samuel, who worked through it with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and who left it in a state that would receive the spring well. Joseph went to school. He came home. He helped his father on weekends. He ate dinner at the small table in the cottage kitchen. He slept in his room with the notebook on the desk and the small hole at the elbow of his school sweater that he had finally stopped picking at. He did not talk about what had happened to anyone at school. It was not his to talk about. He understood this without being told, in the same way he understood most things, by thinking about it long enough that the right answer arrived without announcement. Samuel Addo did not speak much about what had happened. He was not a man who spoke much in general. He was a man who worked, who was present, who showed the things he meant through the consistent quality of his attention. But one morning in late October, walking from the cottage to the kitchen garden with Joseph beside him, he said, "You were right." Joseph looked at him. "To go," Samuel said. "You were right, and I was wrong." He looked at the path ahead of them. "I was trying to protect us. You were trying to do right. Those are not the same thing." He paused. "I should have understood the difference." Joseph walked beside his father in the October morning, through the garden that his father had tended for 9 years and that Joseph had grown up in, the garden that was their home, more than the cottage was their home, because they spent more hours in it and knew it more completely. "You weren't wrong to be afraid," Joseph said. "No," Samuel said, "but I was wrong to let the fear decide." They reached the kitchen garden. Samuel picked up his tools. Joseph picked up his own, the smaller ones, the ones his father had taught him to use correctly at age 6, starting with the idea that a tool used correctly was a tool that lasted. They worked in silence for a while, the garden around them in its late-season configuration, the leaves coming down from the oaks, the roses past their bloom, the apple tree at the east end of the garden, bare of its last 3 apples now, the branches showing against the pale October sky in the specific clear way that bare branches showed when the light was at the right angle. Joseph looked at the apple tree. He thought about the longer route he had taken 3 days before everything happened because of those 3 apples on that tree, and about the 10 feet of distance from the east wall, and about the specific angle at which the landing window was visible from that spot in the garden. He thought, "I took the longer route because of those apples." He thought, "If I had taken the short route, I would not have been at that angle." He thought about that for a moment, the specific randomness of it, the way 3 apples on a tree had put him in the one position from which the truth was visible. He thought, "You can't plan for the right angle. You can only make sure you're looking when you get there." He wrote this in his notebook that evening, in the cottage, at the small table in his room, while his father made dinner in the kitchen and the smell of it came under the door. He wrote it in his careful handwriting, in the notebook where he kept the things that seemed worth keeping. Then he put the notebook away and went for dinner. Edward Calloway came to the cottage on a Sunday morning in December, which was not something he had done before in 9 years. He knocked on the door, and Samuel opened it, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, with the December garden behind Edward and the cottage warmth behind Samuel, and neither of them quite certain of the protocol for this particular visit. "I wanted to come myself," Edward said, "not through Charles, not through anyone else." Samuel stepped back and let him in. Joseph was at the small table doing his homework. He looked up when Edward came in, and then looked back at his homework, because looking at it seemed like the right thing to do while the adults talked. Edward sat in the chair Samuel indicated. Samuel sat across from him. The cottage kitchen was the kind of space that made large things feel more manageable than they did in large rooms. Low ceiling, the smell of food, the particular warmth of a small heated space in December. Edward told them the outcome. Diana Reeve had been charged. The trial date had been set. The evidence, physical, testimonial, the specific combination of what the forensic team had found and what Joseph had described, was sufficient. His solicitor was confident. He told them this in the same flat order that serious information required. When he finished, Samuel nodded once. "Joseph," Edward said. He looked at the boy at the table. "You may have to testify. Not certainly, but possibly. The lawyers will know more as it gets closer. I want you to know that if it comes to that, you'll be prepared and supported. You won't go into a courtroom alone." Joseph looked at him. "I'll say what I saw," he said. "In the same order, the same way I said it to you." "Yes," Edward said. "That's exactly right." He looked at Samuel. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly." Samuel looked at him. "What you did 3 days ago, what you chose, I understand it." Edward's voice was steady and without performance. "I understand what you were protecting and why. I'm not here to judge that decision. The decision your son made is his, not a reflection on yours." He paused. "And I want to say this also. The cottage, your position here, the garden, none of that was ever in question. Not from me. Whatever you were afraid of, it was not something I would have done." Samuel looked at the table. He looked at his hands on it, the permanently stained knuckles, the careful, strong hands. "I didn't know that," Samuel said quietly. "I know you're a fair man, Mr. Calloway. But I didn't know that. And when you don't know, the fear fills in what you don't know." "Yes," Edward said. "That's honest. And I should have, over 9 years, I should have made it clearer. What a person's position here depends on, and what it doesn't." He paused. "I'm sorry I didn't." The cottage was quiet for a moment. Outside the small window, the December garden was bare and still. Joseph looked at his homework. He was not doing it. He was listening to his father and the man his father worked for saying true things to each other in the cottage kitchen on a Sunday morning, and it seemed to him that this was worth listening to more than the homework was worth doing. His father looked up. "You should eat," Samuel said to Edward. "I was about to make breakfast." Edward looked at him. "If you want," Samuel said. Edward looked around the cottage kitchen. He looked at the small table where Joseph's homework was spread out, at the window with the December garden visible, at the 2 cups already on the counter and the pan on the stove. "Yes," Edward said. "Thank you." Samuel stood and went to the stove. Joseph went back to his homework. The December morning continued outside the cottage window, the garden bare, and the oaks bare, and the apple tree bare. Everything that had been growing through the year stripped back now to its essential form, the branches and the structure and the specific shape of things that only became fully visible when everything else was gone.